A man can spend 3 decades building a fortress around his children, brick by brick, bill by bill, convinced that every wall he raises is an act of love. It never occurs to him that a fortress with no door is also a prison, and that the people inside it never learn how to survive outside its gates. I know that now. I learned it on a Thursday morning in March, lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my arm, listening to the silence where my own children's voices should have been. Blood gives you children. It takes something else entirely to earn the right to be called family. Welcome back to the channel. If you believe loyalty is proven in the hard seasons and not the easy ones, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. I answer every story you share with me, and this community means more to me than most of you know. To understand how I ended up in that hospital bed, staring at a ceiling tile and re-evaluating 58 years of my life, you have to go back further, to the kind of quiet history that never makes it into anyone's highlight reel. My name is Walter. I'm 62 years old, and for 31 years I ran a small fleet of delivery trucks out of a lot on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. Nothing glamorous. Diapers, dry goods, hardware store inventory, the unglamorous plumbing of a town that keeps running because men like me show up at 4 in the morning whether we feel like it or not. My wife, Carol, passed from ovarian cancer when our daughter Megan was 11 and our son Tyler was 14. I remember standing in the kitchen the week after the funeral, looking at 2 kids who had just lost their mother, and making a promise to myself that neither of them would ever again feel like the ground could disappear beneath their feet. I decided, right there at that counter, that I would be the ground, permanent, unshakable, whatever it cost me. It cost me plenty, and I paid it gladly, for years, without complaint. What I didn't understand back then was that a father who never lets his children feel the weight of consequence isn't protecting them. He's just delaying the day someone else has to teach them what he refused to. My brother Frank died of a stroke 9 years ago, far too young, at 51. He left behind a son, my nephew Caleb, who was 17 at the time and suddenly without a father of his own. Frank hadn't left Caleb much in the way of money. He'd left him something better, though nobody could put a price on it. He'd raised a boy who noticed things. I remember the week of the funeral. Caleb showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, saw me struggling to get a dead oak branch off my roof after a storm, and without a single word climbed up there himself in his church shoes and helped me haul it down. He never mentioned it again. That was Caleb. He worked weekends at a hardware store on Linden Avenue through high school, and later while he studied automotive technology at the community college. And every single month, without being asked, he'd hand me $60 toward groceries when he was staying with us, because he said it wasn't right to eat a man's food and not contribute. He was 19 years old, doing math that some men never learn to do their whole lives. My own children were a different story, and the fault for that sits with me more than it ever sat with them. Tyler is 26 now. Megan is 23. When Tyler totaled his first car, a Ford Focus, sliding through black ice on Route 4 because he was going 40 in a 25, I didn't make him take the bus for 6 months and learn the lesson written into every skid mark on that road. I bought him a new one, a Jeep, because I couldn't stand the thought of him walking through a Ohio winter feeling smaller than his friends. When Megan quit her job at the marketing firm downtown after 8 months because her manager didn't respect her creative vision, I didn't ask her to sit with the discomfort of unemployment for even a week. I kept her rent covered on her apartment near the river, kept her car payment current, told myself I was investing in her future, while I was, in fact, financing her avoidance of ever having one. I gave them a life with no edges, no sharp corners, nothing that could ever teach them what it feels like to fall and have to stand back up on their own. I told myself that was love. It was actually the opposite. It was fear wearing love's clothing. The reckoning arrived on the second Tuesday of March, at 11 in the morning, though I didn't know yet that it was a reckoning. I had been feeling off for about a week, a tightness in my chest I chalked up to the cold I couldn't seem to shake, a fatigue that felt heavier than a 62-year-old man's fatigue should feel. Megan and Tyler had planned a 10-day trip to Cancun with a group of their friends, a trip I had paid for, $6,000 between flights and the resort, because Tyler had mentioned once, almost in passing, that he'd never taken a real vacation, and the words had lodged themselves in my chest like a splinter I couldn't leave alone. 2 days before they were set to fly out, the tightness in my chest turned into something I couldn't ignore. My left arm went numb somewhere around dinner time, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I drove myself to Miami Valley Hospital, gripping the wheel with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and by the time the doctors got me back to a bed and hooked up to monitors, a young cardiologist named Dr. Patricia Nunez was telling me, in the calm, careful voice doctors use when they don't want you to panic, that I had suffered a mild heart attack and that they'd be keeping me for observation, possibly for a procedure, depending on what the imaging showed. I called Tyler from the hospital bed with my hand still trembling from the adrenaline, or maybe from something closer to grief. He picked up on the fourth ring, the sound of a video game blaring behind him. I told him what had happened, that the doctor used the words heart attack, that I didn't know yet if I'd need a procedure. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause where you can hear a person recalculating their weekend instead of recalculating their concern for you. He said, "Dad, that's really scary, but they've got you monitored, right? You're in good hands. We already checked in for our flight." I told him I understood, because that's what I always told them. Understanding wrapped around my own disappointment, like a blanket I'd been sewing my whole life. Megan texted rather than called. Her message read, "Oh my God, Dad, I'm so sorry. Keep us posted. Love you," followed by a string of hearts, sent at 11:47 that night, 3 hours after I'd told her the news, while she was, according to the timestamp on a photo she posted an hour later, already trying on sundresses for the trip. They flew out 2 days later. On the same morning, a doctor named Raj Patel sat at the foot of my hospital bed and told me they'd found 70% blockage in one of my arteries and would need to place a stent before I went home. Caleb showed up at the hospital that morning, still in his work coveralls, having left in the middle of his shift the moment he heard, and he stayed in the waiting room chair through the entire procedure, through the recovery, through the night after, sleeping upright in a chair that could not have been comfortable for a man his size, because he said he wasn't going to let me wake up alone in a hospital room while my own kids were somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico. If this story is bringing back a memory of your own, a moment where you needed the people closest to you and found out who actually shows up, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button now. These stories matter more when we tell them together. The days that followed moved slowly. The particular slowness of hospital time, where minutes stretch out long and flat, like a road with no landmarks. Caleb drove 40 minutes each way from his apartment every single day after his shift at the auto shop where he'd worked his way up to lead technician. And every evening he brought something with him, a crossword puzzle he thought I'd like, a container of the vegetable soup his mother used to make, once a small transistor radio, because he remembered me mentioning I missed listening to the ball game on something other than my phone. He never once brought up Cancun. He never once complained about the overtime he was giving up to sit with me, or the fact that his own father, my brother, would have wanted someone to do exactly this for him and never got the chance. He simply showed up, day after day, the way water shows up in a riverbed, without asking for credit. On the fourth day, lying propped up against 2 thin hospital pillows with an IV line taped to the back of my hand, I picked up my phone and saw that Tyler had posted a video from a catamaran, shirtless, laughing, a drink with a little paper umbrella balanced on the railing beside him, the caption reading, "Living my best life, no bad vibes allowed." Megan had posted a photo of her toes in white sand with the caption, "The ocean fixes everything." Neither of them had called that day. Neither of them had called the day before. I set the phone face down on the blanket and looked over at Caleb, who was sitting in the vinyl recliner beside my bed, quietly refilling my water pitcher from the tap in the little bathroom. And something inside me that had been bending under weight for 30 years finally, quietly, without drama, broke. Not my heart. That had already been broken and stitched back together by a surgeon's hands. Something else broke. The part of me that kept making excuses. I thought about the will I'd drawn up 11 years earlier, back when Carol had first gotten sick, and I'd wanted everything settled in case the worst happened to both of us. Everything split evenly between Tyler and Megan. The house on Brantwood Lane where they'd grown up, my share of the trucking company, the modest but steady investment account I'd built by living beneath my means for 3 decades so my kids would never have to. I had built an entire structure of protection around 2 people who, when the wind actually blew, when their own father's heart had literally stopped working correctly, chose a catamaran over a phone call. I lay there in that bed, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years, not sadness exactly, but a kind of clarity, cold and clean as well water. I had spent my whole life being their shield. It was time to find out what kind of men and women they'd become without one. They discharged me on a Friday, 8 days after I'd first driven myself to the hospital, with a folder of prescriptions and a stern warning from Dr. Patel about stress and rest, and following up with cardiology in 2 weeks. Caleb drove me home in his old pickup truck, insisted on carrying my bag inside, and made me a plate of eggs and toast before he'd let me sit down, fussing over me like an old hen, which from a 26-year-old man built like a linebacker was equal parts absurd and deeply moving. Once I was settled on the couch with a blanket over my legs, I asked him to hand me the phone from the side table, and I made a call I'd been turning over in my mind through every quiet hospital night. I called Marion Hale, the attorney who had handled my affairs for nearly 2 decades. A sharp, no-nonsense woman I trusted the way you trust a level to tell you the truth about a wall. I told her I needed her to come to the house, that I wanted to restructure the trust, the deed, the succession plan for the trucking company, everything, and that I wanted it finalized before my son and daughter got back from Mexico. Marion was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she asked me, gently, if I was sure, if this was something I wanted to do while I was still recovering, still emotional. I told her I had never been steadier in my life, that the emotional decision would have been to say nothing and let this keep happening. She told me she'd be at the house Monday morning with everything drawn up. If you're glad to see a man finally stand up for the value of his own life's work, go ahead and drop a comment below letting me know. It helps this story find the people who need to hear it. Over that weekend, the messages from Tyler and Megan trickled in, thin and distracted. The kind of communication people send when their attention is elsewhere and their conscience is sending only the minimum required signal to keep it quiet. Megan texted Saturday evening, asking if I could Venmo her $80 because she'd lost an earring in the ocean and wanted to buy a replacement at the resort gift shop before they flew home. I stared at that message for a long time. I didn't reply. I let it sit there, a small gray bubble on a bright screen, the way I'd let so many things sit unaddressed for so many years. Tyler sent one message the whole weekend, a photo of a sunset with the caption, "Wish you were here. Feel better, Dad." Sent, I noticed, at 9:40 at night, likely after several drinks, likely because the sunset had briefly nudged his conscience before the next round arrived. Monday morning, Marion Hale arrived at 9 sharp, sat with me at my own dining room table for 3 hours, papers spread across the wood in neat, deliberate rows, each one representing a piece of the life I'd spent decades assembling. Caleb was in the garage most of that morning, working on the transmission of his own truck, entirely unaware of what was unfolding 20 feet away in my dining room. By noon, everything was signed, witnessed, notarized. The trucking company's succession plan now named Caleb as the incoming operational partner, with a clear path to full ownership over 5 years, a role he'd earned 100 times over through 9 years of quietly showing up and asking for nothing. The house on Brantwood Lane, the house Carol and I had bought together 30 years earlier, the house where Tyler and Megan had grown up sliding down the banister and slamming doors during arguments about curfews, now belonged to a newly established family trust with Caleb named as its sole beneficiary. Tyler and Megan were still my children. Nothing on paper would ever change that fact, and nothing in my heart wanted to. But the practical architecture of what I would leave behind, the tangible weight of 31 years of work, was no longer going to be handed to 2 people who had shown me, with total clarity, exactly what they valued and what they didn't. Tyler and Megan flew back into Dayton on a Wednesday afternoon, their skin sun-browned, their suitcases heavy with souvenirs, laughing about something on the drive from the airport that I never learned the details of. I know this because they told me so themselves when they walked through the front door of the house on Brantwood Lane at a little past 3, expecting, I imagine, to find their father resting on the couch, ready to hear about their trip, ready to slide back into the familiar shape of a relationship where he absorbed and they received. Instead, they found me sitting upright at the dining room table, dressed properly for the first time in over a week, with Marion Hale seated to my right, a leather folder open in front of her, her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. Tyler stopped in the doorway of the dining room, his duffel bag still on his shoulder, his tan face going still. He asked, "Dad, what is this? Who's this?" I didn't raise my voice. I hadn't raised my voice with either of them in years, and I wasn't going to start now. Not when calm was the only tool sharp enough for what needed cutting. I told them to sit down, that we had some things to discuss as a family. Megan dropped her bag onto a chair with a dramatic sigh, complaining that she'd just gotten off a 4-hour flight and wanted a shower, not a meeting. Marion looked at her over the rim of her glasses and told her, in the flat, professional tone of a woman who had delivered this kind of news before, that she'd want to sit down for this one. I told them about the hospital, about the 70% blockage, about lying in that bed with a tube in my arm listening to a video game in the background of my own son's phone call. I told them about the 4 days I spent recovering with no calls, only a request for $80, and a caption about the ocean fixing everything. Tyler tried to interrupt, his voice climbing, saying they didn't know it was that serious, that I'd told them I'd be fine, that Caleb was already there, so what was the actual problem? I held up my hand, and for the first time in his adult life, my son actually stopped talking when I asked him to. I told him that Caleb stayed because Caleb understands what the word family actually requires, and that the difference between a man who shows up and a man who sends a text with a sunset attached is the entire difference in this world, even if it doesn't always show up on a bank statement. I told them what Marion had finalized. The house on Brantwood Lane, now held in trust for Caleb. The trucking company, now on a succession path toward Caleb's ownership. Megan's monthly rent support ended as of that day. Tyler's car payment, which I had quietly been covering the difference on for 2 years without either of them fully realizing it, ended as well. Megan stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over, her voice cracking as she asked me how I could do this to my own children, how I could give everything to a nephew over the 2 people I raised. I looked at her, and I told her the truth as plainly as I could manage. I told her I didn't raise 2 people who understood consequence. I raised 2 people who understood comfort, and that was a failure that belonged to me as much as to her. But that failure ended today. I told them both they had 30 days to find their own housing, not 45 minutes, not a cruelty, just a clear and firm line. Because unlike the way I'd handled every hard moment before this one, I intended to be fair without being weak. Tyler didn't yell. He sat there with his tan arms on the table, staring at the wood grain, and I watched something settle into his shoulders that looked almost like understanding, though I know now it would take him much longer than one conversation to actually arrive there. Megan cried, but I recognized the shape of those tears, the same shape I'd seen my whole life, tears for a comfort ending rather than tears for a father nearly lost. They gathered their suitcases from the hallway eventually, the wheels rattling against the hardwood floor, and the front door closed behind them with a sound quieter than I expected, given everything the moment carried. When the house went silent again, Caleb walked in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, and stood in the doorway of the dining room looking at the papers still spread across the table. He asked me what happened, and when I explained it to him, plainly, the way I'd explained it to Tyler and Megan, he sat down slowly across from me and told me he didn't want any of it, that he hadn't shown up at that hospital thinking about a house or a company, that he'd shown up because I was his uncle and I needed someone in the room. I told him I knew that better than anyone, and that was exactly why it belonged to him. A man who wants nothing is precisely the man who should be trusted with everything. The house was quiet that evening. In a way, it hadn't been quiet in years, but it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the particular stillness of a place where the right kind of weight has finally settled into the right kind of hands. I sat on the back porch as the sun went down over the yard Carol used to garden in, and I thought about the promise I'd made at that kitchen counter all those years ago. The promise to always be the ground beneath my children's feet. I understood, finally, sitting there with a mended heart and a mended understanding of what love actually requires, that the ground doesn't do a person any good if they never learn to stand on their own two legs. I hadn't failed by loving my children too little. I had failed by never once letting them feel the cost of anything, and it had taken a hospital bed and a nephew with a good heart to show me the difference between raising children and simply cushioning them. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life who showed up when it counted, or if it reminded you of a lesson you learned later than you wish you had, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Take care of the people who take care of you, and I'll see you in the next story.